I was celebrating my birthday with my family at a restaurant when a waitress subtly slid a folded note onto my table. "Don't drink that." I froze, absolutely stunned. I decided to discreetly switch my wine glass with my daughter-in-law's. And what transpired a mere 5 minutes later completely reshaped everything. My name is Celeste Montgomery, and I'm 62 years old. Never in a million years would I have imagined that my 62nd birthday would not only save my life, but also expose the shocking depths of betrayal within my own family. It was a Friday night and my son Marcus had taken me to Giovanni's Trattoria, that beloved Italian restaurant of mine nestled right in our Atlanta, Georgia neighborhood. He had chosen it supposedly because he knew how much I adored it, or so I believed at the time. Allison Whitlock, my daughter-in-law, was seated across from me, flashing that smile that I'd always found just a tad forced, which I'd always chalked up to her being nervous or maybe just a little shy. The restaurant was positively buzzing with families out celebrating, creating a lively backdrop for the evening. The ambience was warm and welcoming, with soft lighting casting a cozy golden glow on the rustic wooden tables, and the irresistible aroma of garlic and basil wafting through the air, promising a delicious meal. Marcus had ordered a bottle of California Cabernet Sauvignon to mark the occasion with a toast, and I truly felt happy and grateful to be surrounded by my small, close-knit family. "Mom, you look absolutely radiant tonight," Marcus said with a warm smile, as he carefully poured the wine into our glasses. His eyes twinkled with affection, and in that instant, I felt like the luckiest mother in the entire world. Allison gave a nod, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, but I was far too swept up in the joy of the moment to even notice. We had all ordered our favorite dishes. I of course went with the chicken parmesan, my absolute go-to whenever I dine there. Marcus opted for the spaghetti bolognese, while Allison ordered a Caesar salad, explaining that she was watching her figure. Throughout the dinner, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Marcus talked about his work at the State Farm office downtown, and I shared some stories about my gardening adventures and the senior yoga class that I'd recently started attending at the local YMCA. Yet there was a nagging feeling I couldn't quite shake, a subtle tension that seemed to be emanating from Allison. Whenever Marcus turned to speak to me, I noticed she'd watch him with an odd expression that I couldn't quite place. Her fingers drummed restlessly on the table, and I caught her glancing at her cell phone multiple times, and in a way that wasn't exactly discreet. When the time came for the toast, Marcus stood up, raising his glass high with purpose. "To Mom," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "for being the strongest woman I know, for raising us with so much love and care after Dad passed, and for teaching me the true meaning of resilience." His touching words warmed my heart, and I felt happy tears welling up in my eyes. Allison also raised her glass, but I couldn't help but notice that her hands were trembling just slightly. "To Celeste," she said, her voice sounding a bit strained for someone who's such a special mother-in-law. The slight hesitation she had right before the word special momentarily caught my attention, but I decided to simply brush it off. Just as I was about to bring the glass to my lips, I sensed someone approaching our table. It was one of the waitresses, a young woman with her brown hair neatly pulled back in a ponytail. She leaned in subtly, as if she were wiping a small spill from the table, and stealthily slid a small, folded piece of paper next to my plate. The move was so smooth and seamless that neither Marcus nor Allison seemed to notice a thing. The waitress, Jada Reynolds, gave me an intense, almost pleading look before quickly heading off to another section of the restaurant. My heart began to pound in my chest. With trembling hands, I unfolded the paper beneath the table, careful to keep it hidden from view. The words were written in a clear, urgent script. "Don't drink that. Your life is in danger. Trust me." The world seemed to stand still. The lively sounds of the restaurant faded into a distant murmur, and I felt as though I was observing the whole scene from outside of my own body. My initial reaction was to dismiss it as some kind of terrible joke, but the look I'd seen in the waitress's eyes conveyed a seriousness that I simply couldn't ignore. I glanced down at my wine glass, the very glass that, just moments before, I had been so excited to taste from. Now it seemed sinister, almost menacing. I managed to maintain a neutral expression on my face while my mind raced with possibilities. Marcus and Allison continued chatting away, completely unaware of what had just transpired. "Excuse me," I said, hoping that my voice sounded somewhat natural. "I need to run to the restroom for a second." I stood up on shaky legs, discreetly slipping the paper into my pocket. As I made my way toward the back of the restaurant, my mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear. In the restroom I reread the note, half expecting that the words might magically change. The handwriting was feminine, rushed, but still perfectly legible. There was no signature or any further explanation, just that direct, terrifying warning. When I returned to the table, I did my best to act like everything was normal, but inside I was absolutely terrified. I looked at Marcus and Allison with completely new eyes. Marcus seemed perfectly normal, talking animatedly about his plans to renovate their kitchen. But Allison, something was definitely different about her. Her eyes darted nervously between my glass and my face, as if she were anxiously waiting for something to happen. That was the precise moment that I made a decision that would change everything. When Marcus briefly turned away to flag down our server for more bread, I seized the opportunity. With one quick, casual movement, I switched my glass with Allison's. The liquid looked identical, the same Cabernet we'd been drinking all night. "All right," I finally said, raising the glass that was now mine. "A toast to this beautiful family moment." Marcus smiled broadly and raised his glass in response. Allison, completely unaware of the switch, raised hers too, the one that had originally been mine. We all took a sip at the same time. The wine tasted exactly the same as always, but I could barely focus on it. I was intently watching Allison, searching for any sign that something was amiss. At first, nothing seemed to happen. We continued to eat and chat. Marcus told me about a promotion he was hoping to receive at his firm, and I talked about my upcoming plans to visit my sister in Portland, Oregon that fall. Allison participated in the conversation, but I noticed that she seemed increasingly uneasy. It was precisely 5 minutes after the toast that it began. Allison suddenly pressed a hand to her stomach, wearing a look of confusion on her face. "I feel a little funny," she muttered, almost inaudibly. Marcus immediately looked concerned, asking if she was feeling okay. She shook her head, saying she'd probably eaten something that hadn't agreed with her at lunch, but then her face began to pale visibly. Her hands started trembling, no longer from nerves like before, but uncontrollably. "I really don't feel well," she whispered, and I could see beads of sweat forming on her forehead, even though the restaurant was comfortably cool. Marcus immediately jumped to his feet, supporting his wife by the shoulders. "Honey, what is it?" he asked, his voice laced with alarm. I remained seated, watching the scene unfold with a mix of horror and terrible fascination. Allison attempted to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed back into her chair, breathing erratically. Her eyes were glassy, and her skin had taken on a grayish tint that terrified me. "Call 911, I yelled at Marcus, though my voice sounded eerily calm considering the situation. Panic rippled through the restaurant as other diners began to realize that something serious was happening. While we waited anxiously for the paramedics to arrive, my mind couldn't stop replaying the chilling words from the note. "Your life is in danger." And now, I knew with a blood-chilling certainty that the person who had been in danger all along was me. The ambulance ride to St. Jude Medical Center felt like an absolute nightmare. Allison had lost consciousness, and the paramedics were working frantically to stabilize her. Marcus held my hand tightly in the back seat, his eyes filled with terror and confusion. I clutched the waitress's note in my fist, feeling like it was the only tangible proof that I wasn't going completely insane. In the emergency room, the doctors immediately whisked Allison away. Marcus and I were left sitting in those incredibly uncomfortable plastic chairs that seem designed to make you feel even more miserable than you already are. The harsh smell of disinfectant made me nauseous, and the unforgiving fluorescent lights cast a cold and sterile atmosphere. "I just don't understand what happened," Marcus muttered for what felt like the 5th time, running his hands anxiously through his hair. "She was perfectly fine just an hour ago." Maybe it was something she ate, or maybe she caught a stomach flu. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to tell him about the note just yet. Not until I was absolutely sure of what had really happened. But deep down, I knew that this was no simple case of food poisoning. The waitress's dire words resonated in my head like a non-stop alarm. After what felt like an eternity, a young doctor with a neatly trimmed beard approached us. His expression was serious, and I could tell from the look in his eyes that he had some news that he didn't quite know how to deliver. "Are you the family of Allison Whitlock?" he asked, his voice somber. "I'm her husband," Marcus immediately replied. "This is my mother. How is Allison doing?" The doctor sat down across from us, which instantly signaled to me that the news wasn't good. "Your wife is stable for the time being, but we need to discuss what caused her collapse." He paused, carefully choosing his words. "The results from the blood work came back, and they show the presence of digoxin in extremely high levels." Marcus furrowed his brow. "Digoxin? What exactly is that?" "It's a heart medication," the doctor explained. "In normal doses it helps regulate the heart rhythm, but the amount we found in her system is, well, it's potentially lethal." I felt as if I'd been physically punched in the stomach. "Are you saying that someone poisoned her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I can't make that determination," the doctor replied cautiously, "but I can confidently tell you that this amount of digoxin did not enter her system accidentally. We're going to have to contact the police to launch an investigation." Marcus abruptly stood up and began pacing back and forth in the small, confined space. "This is simply impossible," he muttered in disbelief. "No one would ever want to hurt Allison. She's a good person. Who in their right mind would do something like that?" I knew the answer, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud just yet. I desperately needed more information. "Doctor," I said, "is it possible for someone to put this medication in a drink?" "Definitely," he replied. "Digoxin can easily dissolve in liquids, and in this case we also detected alcohol in her system, which can significantly intensify the toxic effects." That was all the confirmation I needed. I pulled the crumpled note from my pocket with trembling hands and showed it to Marcus. His eyes widened in disbelief as he read the words. "Mom, where on earth did you get this?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. I proceeded to tell him everything. The waitress, the cryptic message, my split-second decision to swap the glasses. With each and every word, I watched the color drain from Marcus's face. When I finally finished recounting the story, he sank heavily into the chair, as if he'd suddenly lost all of his strength. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Are you saying that someone actually tried to poison you?" "That's precisely what I'm saying," I replied firmly, though I was shaking uncontrollably on the inside. The doctor listened intently with a grave expression. "I will report this to the police immediately," he said. "And we're going to need to run blood tests on both of you as well to make absolutely sure that you haven't ingested anything dangerous." After the doctor excused himself, Marcus and I sat in a heavy silence. I could see his mind racing, struggling to process the shocking information, desperately trying to reach conclusions that he simply didn't want to accept. "Marcus," I said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, unspeakable pain. "Have you noticed anything strange about Allison's behavior lately? Anything at all different at home?" Marcus hesitated for a long moment before responding. When he finally did, his voice was barely a whisper. "A few months ago, she started getting really worried about your health." He stopped abruptly, as if he didn't want to continue the sentence. "What kind of worries?" I pressed gently. "She kept saying that she'd noticed you seemed confused sometimes, that you were forgetting things, that maybe we should start considering care options for you." The words seemed to physically pain him to say. My blood ran cold. Care options? Like a nursing home? She said she had been researching some very nice places, and that it would be better for you to have professional care. Marcus mumbled, unable to meet my gaze. "Marcus," I said, my voice trembling. I don't have any memory problems. I'm not confused. I'm perfectly fine. I know, he whispered. My God, Mom, I know. But she was so incredibly convincing. She showed me articles about early onset dementia, talked to me about all the red flags, and I guess I just wanted to believe that she was simply looking out for you. What else? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I truly wanted to hear the answer. Marcus covered his face with his hands. Last month, she suggested that I should get power of attorney over your finances. She said it was just a precaution, in case something unexpected happened to you. His voice cracked with emotion. I was actually about to agree. I thought it was the responsible thing to do. I felt physically sick. The whole picture was starting to come into sharp focus, and it was far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. Allison hadn't just been planning to poison me. She had been meticulously laying the groundwork to make my death seem inevitable, perhaps even expected. Is there anything else? I asked, my voice barely audible. Marcus continued, his voice trembling. About 3 weeks ago, I found some bottles of pills in her purse. When I asked her about them, she said they were just vitamins for herself. But now that I really think about it, I never actually saw her take them. Do you happen to remember what kind of pills they were? I honestly don't know. They were small, white pills, but there were a lot of them in different bottles. Just then a nurse approached us. Mrs. Montgomery? She asked. I'm Celeste Montgomery, I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. The police are here, and they'd like to speak with you. Also, the doctor wants to inform you about something we discovered in the additional analyses. We followed the nurse to a small private room where 2 detectives and the doctor we'd met earlier were waiting. The doctor's expression was even more serious than before. We've done some more detailed analyses, he began, and we found something quite disturbing. Mrs. Whitlock didn't just have digoxin in her system. She also had traces of other cardiac medications. It appears that she had been ingesting small amounts of these medications over a prolonged period. My world spun. Are you saying that someone has been gradually poisoning me? That is the most likely explanation for what we are seeing, the doctor confirmed grimly. One of the detectives, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, Detective Lieutenant Lee, leaned forward. Mrs. Montgomery, have you been taking any medication recently? Have you perhaps noticed any unusual symptoms? I thought back over the past few months, the occasional dizzy spells that I dismissed as a simple sign of aging, the bouts of fatigue that I'd assumed were perfectly normal, the fleeting moments of confusion that had worried me, but which I'd ultimately decided to ignore. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I've been feeling things, but I just thought it was all part of getting older. Marcus squeezed my hand tightly. Mom, why didn't you say anything to me? Because I didn't want to worry you, I replied. And because Allison assured me it was perfectly normal for my age. The words hung heavy in the air like a damning accusation. And that was the precise moment that I truly realized that my own daughter-in-law had been systematically trying to kill me, all while simultaneously convincing my son that I was slowly losing my mind. The monster hadn't come from outside. She had been living inside my own family, right under my very nose. The next few days passed in what felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Allison remained in the intensive care unit, stable but still unconscious. Marcus had stayed by my side practically every minute, as if he feared something might happen to me if he left me alone. The guilt was absolutely consuming him, and I could see it etched in every single line on his face. Detective Lee had visited me 3 times in the last 4 days. She was a meticulous woman with incredibly sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through any and all lies, and each conversation we had revealed more pieces of the horrific puzzle that my life had somehow become over the last few months. Mrs. Montgomery, she said during our most recent meeting, we've been looking into your daughter-in-law's background. What we've uncovered is quite troubling. We were sitting in my living room, the very same room where Allison had so often come to care for me during my supposed episodes of confusion. Now, every corner of that room felt tainted by her lies and deceit. Allison worked as a certified nursing assistant, or CNA, for 5 years before she married your son. Detective Lee continued, her voice measured. She had access to a wide range of medications and was perfectly familiar with the effects of different substances. Marcus, who was sitting beside me, looked more haggard each day. But why would she ever want to hurt Mom? I never once sensed that she had any kind of problem with her. The detective exchanged a meaningful glance with me before answering. Mr. Montgomery, we've reviewed your mother's financial records. Are you aware that you are the sole beneficiary of her will? Of course, Marcus replied, clearly confused. She's my mother, but that doesn't mean anything. I never wished for anything to happen to her for money. No, but your wife was certainly aware of the inheritance, the detective said softly. And according to our investigation, she had been pressuring you to have your mother make some changes to her legal documents. I recalled all those seemingly innocent conversations where Allison had suggested that it would be prudent to get my affairs in order, how she had insisted on accompanying me to various doctor's appointments, always with that worried smile and that voice dripping with false compassion. There's something else, Detective Lee continued, her tone serious. We found some correspondence on Allison's computer. She had been researching assisted living facilities that specialize in dementia patients, very expensive places where residents rarely receive family visits. My stomach churned with disgust and dread. She was planning to have me institutionalized, locked away and forgotten. That appears to be the case, she confirmed. But not only that, we also found searches on how to accelerate cognitive decline in the elderly and methods to make a death appear natural in patients with cardiac conditions. Marcus abruptly stood up and walked over to the window. His shoulders were visibly trembling. My God, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. What kind of monster is she? But I needed to know more. Over the past few days, I'd been remembering incidents that at the time had seemed insignificant, but now took on a far more sinister meaning. Detective Lee, I said, my voice firm. I think I need to tell you about some other things that have been happening. Over the next hour, I recounted everything I could remember. How Allison had started visiting me more frequently several months ago, always bringing tea or some special snack. How after those visits I would often feel strangely tired and confused. How she had subtly started questioning my memory in front of Marcus. She would say things like, Celeste, don't you remember? You already told me that story yesterday. Or, honey, you just asked me that 5 minutes ago. I had actually started doubting myself. I had begun to think that maybe I really was losing my memory. Marcus turned away from the window, his face etched with horror. And I believed her, he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Every time she came home and told me that you'd had an episode, I believed her. I honestly thought that she was being a good wife by looking out for you. Detective Lee took meticulous notes, her expression unreadable. Do you recall any specific episodes, Mrs. Montgomery? Yes, I replied, feeling rage begin to replace the fear. About 2 months ago, Allison came over for lunch. She brought a homemade soup, saying that she'd made too much and didn't want it to go to waste. After eating it, I felt so unwell that I had to lie down. When Marcus arrived home that night, she told him that she'd found me confused, that I didn't even remember having lunch with her. And what did you remember? Detective Lee asked, her eyes focused on mine. I remembered the lunch perfectly, but I felt so incredibly sick and disoriented that I couldn't even defend myself. Marcus took me to the doctor the next day, but by then I was already feeling somewhat better. The doctor said it was probably just a stomach virus. Marcus slumped back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. She was gradually poisoning you, he murmured in disbelief. And I helped her convince you that you were going crazy. It's not your fault, I said, though inside I felt a complex mix of pain and understanding. She is very good at manipulation. She manipulated me too. Detective Lee closed her notebook with a snap. Mrs. Montgomery, there's one more thing that you need to know. The waitress who gave you the note, Jada Reynolds, is currently a nursing student. Her grandmother died 2 years ago under circumstances that are remarkably similar to what you're describing. My blood ran ice cold. What do you mean? I asked, dread filling my voice. Jada's grandmother, Eleanor Washington, began showing signs of confusion and cognitive decline. Her family thought it was simply natural dementia. She was eventually admitted to an assisted living facility, where she tragically died 6 months later from heart failure. But Jada always suspected that something wasn't quite right about the situation. And what does that have to do with me? I asked, my voice trembling. The person who cared for Jada's grandmother, the person who convinced the family that she needed institutional care, was none other than Allison Whitlock. At the time, she was using her maiden name, Allison Peters. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Marcus slowly raised his head, his eyes wide with horrifying realization. Are you saying that my wife, she's done this before? That's exactly what we're investigating, the detective confirmed, her gaze unwavering. Jada recognized Allison at the restaurant. She had been discreetly following her for several weeks, trying to determine if her suspicions were actually correct. When she saw what appeared to be a family situation unfolding, she decided to take action. I thought of that young waitress who had bravely saved my life, a complete stranger who had shown more concern for my well-being than my own daughter-in-law. Where's Jada now? I asked. I'd really like to thank her. She is fully cooperating with our investigation, and I believe she would very much like to speak with you as well. Marcus finally spoke, his voice cracked with raw emotion. Mom, I am so incredibly sorry. I'm so sorry that I ever doubted you. I'm so sorry that I let her do this to you. I reached out and took both of his hands in mine. They were cold and trembling. Marcus, listen to me carefully. Allison is an expert manipulator. This is absolutely not your fault. But I should have seen the signs, he insisted, his voice thick with tears. I should have known that something was terribly wrong. How could you have possibly known? I replied, squeezing his hands gently. She presented herself as the perfect daughter-in-law, always so worried about her elderly mother-in-law. Anyone would have thought that she was simply being kind and caring. Detective Lee stood up, closing her notebook. Mrs. Montgomery, we'll need you to come to the Atlanta Police Precinct tomorrow to give a formal statement. We would also like you to speak with Jada Reynolds if you're willing to do so. Of course, I replied without hesitation. I'll do whatever is necessary. After the detective left, Marcus and I sat in complete silence for a long time. The sheer weight of everything we had discovered was simply overwhelming. Marcus, I finally said, breaking the heavy silence, there's something that you absolutely need to understand. All these months when I felt so confused and sick, the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. The worst part was thinking that I was letting you down, that I was becoming a burden to you. His eyes instantly filled with tears. You were never a burden, Mom. Never. I know that now. But in those moments when Allison would tell me that she was worried about my mental decline, I truly felt like I was losing not only my mind but also your respect and your love. She knew exactly what buttons to push, Marcus murmured, his voice filled with anguish. She knew that my greatest fear was losing you the same way that I lost Dad. My ex-husband had tragically died of Alzheimer's disease when Marcus was just 25 years old. It had been an absolutely devastating experience for the whole family. Watching that strong, brilliant man gradually fade away into a mere shadow of himself. Allison used that experience against us. I continued, my voice trembling with emotion. She knew that you would be terrified of me following your father's path, and she exploited that fear to manipulate you. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes filled with pain, and I fell completely into a sea of despair and sorrow. She set a trap. I was so scared of watching you decline that I didn't question anything she told me. Marcus, yes. When was the first time Allison mentioned my supposed confusion? He thought for a moment. It was shortly after Grandma Margaret passed away and left me that inheritance. My mother had passed away 8 months ago, leaving me a considerable sum of money that I had planned to leave to Marcus. But now I realized that had been the catalyst for Allison's plan. She knew about the money, I said more to myself than to him. She knew everything. She knew everything, Marcus confirmed bitterly. about your will, about Grandma's inheritance, about my fears regarding your health, and she used every piece of information to construct her perfect plan. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to losing everything, not just my life, but my dignity, my independence, and my relationship with my son. Allison had planned to steal everything I cared about, and she had been on the verge of succeeding. But she had underestimated one thing: the power of a compassionate stranger who refused to stay silent when she saw danger. And in the end, that had been her undoing. Jada Reynolds had the most determined eyes I had ever seen. When we met at the coffee shop near the Atlanta Police Department precinct, I could see in her a strength that reminded me of myself at her age. She was petite, barely 23 years old, but there was something about her presence that radiated a wisdom that only comes from pain. "Mrs. Montgomery," she said, sitting across from me, "I've been waiting for this moment for 2 years." "Jada," I replied, taking her hands in mine, "I have no words to thank you for what you did. You saved my life." Her eyes welled up, but her voice remained steady. "I wish I could have saved my grandmother, too." Over the next hour, Jada told me the full story of what had happened to her grandmother, Ella Laner Washington. It was a chilling account because it was too similar to what had been happening to me. "Grandma Ella Laner was the strongest woman I knew," Jada began. "At 78, she was still working in her garden, cooking for the whole family on Sundays, handling her own finances. She was completely independent." "How did she meet Allison?" I asked. "My grandmother fell at the supermarket and hurt her wrist. Allison was there. She introduced herself as a CNA and offered to help her. She seemed so kind, so concerned about an older woman she didn't even know." Jada took a sip of her coffee before continuing. "Allison started visiting my grandmother regularly, bringing her food, helping her with groceries. She claimed she felt lonely because she didn't have family nearby, and that caring for Grandma Ella Laner made her feel useful." "And your family thought it was wonderful," I said, guessing the rest. "Exactly. We were all so grateful that someone was looking out for her. I was in college. My parents were working double shifts. Allison seemed like a gift from heaven." "When did the problem start?" Jada sighed deeply. "After 2 months, Allison started mentioning small incidents, that she had found Grandma confused, that she had forgotten to turn off the stove, that she had repeated the same story several times. Minor but worrying things. My stomach turned as I recognized the pattern. And you all believed her. At first, we didn't want to accept it, but Allison was very convincing. She showed us articles about dementia, talked about red flags, and gradually we started noticing things about Grandma that we hadn't seen before, like she looked more tired. Sometimes she seemed confused when we talked on the phone. There were days she didn't remember conversations we'd had. Allison convinced us that we needed to accept the reality that Grandma was deteriorating." Jada paused, fighting back tears. "The most horrible part is that Grandma started doubting herself too. She would tell me, 'Jada, I think something is wrong with me. Allison tells me I forget things and maybe she's right.' My God," I murmured. "That's exactly what was happening to me." "Yes, and then Allison started suggesting that maybe it was time to consider a specialized residence. She said she had found a wonderful, very expensive, but excellent place, the Serenity Pines Assisted Living, where Grandma would get the care she needed." "And the family agreed?" "Not immediately, but Allison was persistent. She told us we were selfish to keep Grandma at home when she clearly needed professional care, that we were putting our feelings above her well-being. I knew that tactic. Guilt disguised as legitimate concern." "How long was your grandmother at that residence?" 6 months, Jada replied, her voice breaking. 6 months before she died of what they said was natural heart failure. But when I went to visit her there, something wasn't right. Grandma whispered to me that Allison visited often, always bringing her special vitamins that the doctor had prescribed. "Did you investigate those vitamins?" "I tried, but by then it was too late. Grandma had died, and when I inquired about the medications, I was told all her medical information was confidential." Jada wiped her eyes with a napkin. "But I knew something was wrong. My grandmother had a perfectly healthy heart her entire life. She had no history of cardiac problems." "What did you do then?" I started investigating on my own. I discovered that Allison had worked at that residence before getting the CNA job. I also found that there were other similar cases. Elderly people who had been admitted there after sudden cognitive decline, and who had died of heart problems in a relatively short period. Did you tell anyone? I tried, but I had no real proof, only suspicions. The police told me that elderly people with dementia die from complications all the time. The administrators at the residence said they did everything possible for their patients. No one wanted to listen to a college student who was unhealthily processing her grief. But you didn't give up. I couldn't give up. When I saw Allison at that restaurant, it was like seeing a ghost. I had been following her discreetly for weeks, trying to gather evidence. When I saw her with you and saw the way she looked at your glass of wine, I knew she was about to do the same thing again. How did you know it was the wine? I saw her put something in your glass when you and your son were distracted talking. It was very subtle, but I was specifically watching her. In that moment, I had to make a decision. Stay quiet and risk another person dying, or act without solid proof. Thank God you decided to act. Jada nodded. But what terrifies me the most is thinking about how many other people, like my grandmother and like you, Allison, has hurt. How many families have suffered because one woman decided she could gain money and power by manipulating vulnerable elders. That afternoon, Marcus came to pick me up after my meeting with Jada. During the drive home, I told him everything I had learned about Allison's pattern of behavior. Marcus, I said, I need to ask you something else, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Mom, ask me anything you want. Did Allison ever mention anything about my will or financial planning? Marcus visibly tensed. Yes, he admitted after a pause. About 3 months ago, she started bringing up the topic frequently. She said it was important to make sure your affairs were in order, especially with your supposed mental decline. What kind of suggestions did she make? She wanted me to convince you to give me power of attorney. She said it would be easier to manage your finances if something happened to you. She also suggested you should consider putting the title of your house in my name to avoid legal complications later on. My blood froze. And what did you think of those suggestions? First, I resisted. It seemed premature, but Allison was very insistent. She said it was the responsible thing to do, that waiting until it was too late would be a terrible mistake. Marcus, yes. Did I sign any documents in the last few weeks without clearly remembering it? His silence was answer enough. Marcus, I need you to tell me the truth. 2 weeks ago, he finally murmured. Allison said you'd had a particularly bad episode, that you'd been very confused and had expressed concern about your finances. She said you'd asked us to come over to help you organize some papers. And when we arrived, you seemed a little disoriented. Allison had prepared some documents she said had been recommended by your lawyer. You said you wanted to sign them to get everything in order. What documents were they? A limited power of attorney and an addition to your will. I felt as if I'd been punched in the gut. An addition. Allison said you wanted to add a clause that would give me immediate control over your assets if you were declared mentally incompetent. Marcus, I said, my voice trembling, I never requested those documents. I never spoke to my lawyer about that. Allison drugged me that day to make me look confused, and then manipulated me into signing documents I never would have signed in my normal state. Marcus pulled the car over into the parking lot of a local mall and covered his face with his hands. My God, Mom, I was a complete idiot. I should have questioned everything. I should have insisted on speaking to your lawyer directly. Don't blame yourself. She had been preparing for this moment for months. She had conditioned you to believe I was sick, that my judgment was compromised. When the time came to act, you were already prepared to accept her version of events. What are we going to do about those documents? We're going straight to my lawyer tomorrow and we're going to void everything. I will explain the circumstances under which they were signed, and I will make sure Allison never gets access to a single dime of my money. That night, while Marcus called his lawyer to schedule an emergency appointment, I sat in my study and reviewed all my financial documents. The magnitude of what Allison had been planning was terrifying. With those documents I had signed under the influence of her drugs, she would have had virtual control over my entire estate. Once she had me admitted to a residence as a patient with dementia, she would have been able to manipulate my money freely while keeping me sedated and isolated. And eventually, when it was no longer useful to keep me alive, she would have found a way to accelerate my death, just as she had done with Jada's grandmother. It was a perfect plan executed by a woman who had turned murder into an art form. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated the determination of a young woman who refused to forget her grandmother, and that had been her undoing. Allison woke up from the coma 4 days after drinking the poison intended for me. When Detective Lee called to inform me, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. On one hand, I was glad she hadn't died. As monstrous as she was, I didn't want her death on my conscience. On the other hand, I knew her waking up meant I would have to face her face to face. "How is she?" I asked over the phone. "Physically, she's recovering well," Detective Lee replied, "but mentally, well, she's very agitated. She's been asking for her husband constantly, and when we told her you were okay, her reaction was intense." "What kind of reaction?" "Complete denial. She insists there was some kind of mistake, that she would never hurt anyone. But the most concerning thing is that she's also been asking specifically for you, Mrs. Montgomery. She wants to see you." My stomach flipped. "Do I have to see her?" "You're not obligated, but it could be helpful for the case. Sometimes when suspects are confronted directly by their victims, they reveal important information. But I completely understand if you don't feel comfortable." I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to hide, to pretend Allison didn't exist, and let justice run its course without my direct participation. But another part of me, a stronger part, wanted to look her in the eye and tell her she had failed to destroy me. "I'll do it," I finally said, "but I want Marcus to be present." "Of course. Tomorrow afternoon. Does that work for you?" That evening, Marcus and I sat in my kitchen, drinking tea and mentally preparing for what was to come. He had been incredibly protective of me since we discovered the truth, almost as if he feared Allison could hurt me, even from her hospital bed. "Mom," he said, "you don't have to do this. We can let the police and lawyers handle everything." "Yes, I do have to do this," I replied with more firmness than I felt. "I need to see her. I need to understand how I could have been so blind for so long." "You weren't blind. She's an expert manipulator." "Maybe. But I also think part of me didn't want to see the signs because I wanted to believe that I finally had a daughter-in-law who cared about me." Marcus took my hand. "Mom, you've always had people who care about you. You have me." "I know, honey, but it's different. You're my son. You're supposed to love me." Allison chose to be in my life. Or so I thought. The idea that someone would choose me, that they would consider me worthy of affection without familial obligation, that meant a lot to me. And she took advantage of that. Yes, she took advantage of my loneliness, my desire to be loved, my fear of aging. She knew exactly my vulnerable spots and used them against me. The next day, as we entered the hospital, I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. Detective Lee escorted us through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and pain until we reached the room where Allison was being guarded. There was a police officer at the door, which made me feel a little safer. But when the detective opened the door and I saw Allison for the first time since that horrible night at the restaurant, all my mental preparation vanished. She was pale and thin, with 4 tubes connected to her arm, but her eyes had the same calculating intensity they had always held. When she saw me enter, her expression immediately shifted to one of feigned vulnerability. "Celeste," she said in a weak voice, reaching out a hand toward me, "thank God you're okay." I was so worried. I stood near the door, refusing to approach her bed. Marcus positioned himself protectively between us. "Allison," I said, my voice firm, "we know what you did." Her expression of confusion seemed genuine, but I had already learned what a good actress she was. "What are you talking about?" "I'm the one who got sick. Someone tried to poison both of us." "No," I replied, "someone tried to poison me, and that person was you." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something darker in her eyes, but she quickly hid it behind seemingly sincere tears. "Celeste, I don't understand why you're accusing me of something so terrible. I love you like a mother. I would never hurt you." How did you love Jada Reynolds' grandmother, Layla Washington? I asked. The change in her expression was instantaneous. The tears dried, the vulnerability disappeared. And for a moment I saw the real Allison. Cold, calculating, furious. I don't know who you're talking about, she said. But her voice had lost all its feigned warmth. Marcus took a step forward. Allison, we found the medications at our house. We found your correspondence. We know about the money, about the documents you made Mom sign. We know everything. Allison sat up straighter in bed, and her mask of the innocent victim began to completely slip. Marcus, honey, you have to understand. Everything I did was for us, for our future. Our future? He repeated in disbelief. Your mother is older, Marcus. She doesn't have many good years left. Wouldn't it be better if she could enjoy her final years in a place where she received appropriate care, while we built a life together without the burden of constantly worrying about her? The coldness with which she spoke about me, as if I were an inconvenient object, made me nauseous. And the money, Marcus asked, was this all about the money? Allison sighed as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. Money is important, Marcus. Your mother isn't going to live forever. And when she's gone, why shouldn't we make sure we're comfortable? She doesn't need all those savings in a nursing home. Are you talking about killing me? I said, my voice trembling but steady. For the first time, Allison looked directly at me with pure hatred. I'm talking about being practical about an inevitable situation. How were you practical with Jada's grandmother? Her smile turned cruel. Layla Washington was a lonely old woman who was going to die anyway. At least I made sure her final months were comfortable, and that her money ended up in her family's hands. She didn't have anyone else. Her family visited once a month if she was lucky. I was the only one who truly cared about her in the end. Marcus was shaking with rage. How many other people have you hurt, Allison? I haven't hurt anyone, she replied coldly. I've provided a peaceful transition for people who were already suffering. A peaceful transition? I repeated. You call gradually poisoning older people until they die a peaceful transition? I kept them comfortable, she insisted. No pain, no fear. It's more than most people can expect at the end of their lives. Detective Lee, who had been quietly taking notes, finally spoke. Mrs. Whitlock, are you admitting that you intentionally caused the death of Eleanor Washington, and that you plan to do the same to Celeste Montgomery? Allison realized too late what she had revealed. She tried to backtrack. No, I wasn't, I was talking hypothetically. I'm confused from the medication, but the damage was done. She had shown her true self, and everyone in that room had witnessed it. Allison, I said, finally stepping closer to her bed but keeping out of her reach, I want you to know something. For months you made me doubt my own mind. You made me feel like a burden, like I was losing my value as a person. But I survived, and I'm going to make sure you never have the chance to do this to anyone else. Her eyes filled with fury. Stupid old woman, she hissed, you should be grateful. I was going to give you a dignified death. Now you'll rot slowly in some cheap facility where no one cares about you. Marcus moved toward her, but I put my hand on his arm to stop him. She's not worth it, I told him. She can't hurt us anymore. When we left the room, I felt as if I had confronted the demon that had been living in my life for months. It was terrifying but also liberating. How do you feel? Marcus asked me as we walked down the corridor. Like I just woke up from a very long nightmare, I replied, and like I can finally start to heal. That night, Detective Lee called to inform me that Allison had decided to confess in exchange for a plea agreement. She had admitted not only to the attempted murder against me, but also to the deaths of Layla Washington and 2 other elderly women over the last 3 years. 3 more? I asked in horror. Yes, once she started talking, she seemed almost relieved to admit what she had been doing. I think she had been carrying the weight of those secrets for a long time. What will happen to her now? With the confessions and the evidence we have, she will likely face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When I hung up the phone, I felt no triumph or vengeance. I felt only a profound sadness for all the lives Allison had destroyed, and an overwhelming relief that her reign of terror was finally over. But I also knew that the most difficult part of my healing process was just beginning. 6 months after that horrible night at Giovanni's trattoria, I wake up every morning with a feeling I had forgotten existed. Peace. It's a strange sensation after so many months of living in constant fear, doubting my own mind, feeling like I was losing pieces of myself every day. My morning routine has changed completely. I no longer need to obsessively check if I locked the door or turned off the stove because now I trust my memory. I no longer have to question every decision I make, wondering if it's evidence of mental decline. I know my mind is clear, that it always was clear, and that the confusion and forgetfulness were caused by poison, not illness. Marcus comes to visit me every Sunday, and our relationship has transformed in ways I never imagined possible. The guilt he carried for doubting me, for letting Allison manipulate him, had been consuming him for weeks after the trial. But we worked through it together in family therapy, and little by little we've built a new, deeper trust. Mom, he told me during one of our sessions, I think part of me always knew something wasn't right, but it was easier to believe your mind was deteriorating than to face the possibility that my wife was a killer. Why was it easier? The therapist asked him. Because if Mom was sick, I could be the hero who took care of her. But if Allison was lying, that meant I had chosen poorly, that I had brought danger into my mother's life. That would make me the villain of the story. It was painful to hear that, but it was also a relief. Marcus had found the courage to be honest about his own fears and insecurities, and that allowed us to truly heal. Allison's trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified for 2 full days, recounting my story to a jury who listened with a mixture of horror and compassion. Jada Reynolds also testified, speaking bravely about her grandmother's death and her determination to find justice. Allison attempted to use an insanity defense, claiming she suffered from a personality disorder that made her incapable of controlling her actions. But the prosecution presented evidence of years of meticulous planning, internet searches on poisons and murder methods, falsified documents, and deliberate financial manipulation. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected, only emptiness. A woman I had once called family would be sent to prison for the rest of her life. And while I knew it was justice, I couldn't help but feel sadness for what might have been if Allison had chosen a different path. After the trial, I decided to make some important changes in my life. The first was to move. I couldn't continue living in the house where Allison had come so many times to slowly poison me. She had spun such a tangled web. I was so terrified of seeing you slip away, that my judgment was totally clouded. I didn't challenge a word she uttered. Marcus, that's right. When did Allison first start suggesting I was losing it? He paused, thinking. It wasn't long after dear Grandma Margaret's passing, and when I inherited that money from her. My own mother had died 8 months prior, leaving me a pretty penny, which I intended to pass along to Marcus. But looking back, I see that was the starting gun for Allison's whole scheme. She was after the money, I murmured almost to myself. She knew everything. Marcus confirmed with a sigh. She knew everything. She knew about your will, Grandma's inheritance, even your worries about your health. She twisted it all to fit her wicked design. That night, lying awake staring at the ceiling, it hit me. I nearly lost it all. Not just my life, but my very dignity, my freedom, and the precious bond with my son. Allison plotted to steal every single thing I held dear, and was almost successful. But she overlooked one crucial factor: the unwavering spirit of a kind-hearted stranger who couldn't stand by and watch injustice unfold. Ultimately, that proved to be her downfall. Jada Reynolds possessed the most determined gaze I'd ever encountered. Meeting her at that little coffee shop near the Atlanta PD, I saw a spark in her that reminded me of my younger self. She was petite, hardly more than a kid at 23, but she carried herself with a wisdom beyond her years, born from hardship. Mrs. Montgomery, she began, settling in across from me. I've been waiting 2 years for this moment. Grasping her hands in mine, I replied, Jada, I can't thank you enough for what you did. You saved my life. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, yet her voice remained steady. I only wish I could have saved my grandma too. Over the next hour, Jada poured out the story of her grandmother, Layla Washington. It was chilling how closely it mirrored my own experience. Jada began. Grandma Layla was the strongest woman I knew. Even at 78, she was still tending her garden, cooking Sunday dinners for the whole family, and managing her own finances. She was completely independent, a force of nature. How did she even meet Allison? I interjected. My grandmother took a tumble at the grocery store, hurting her wrist. Allison just happened to be there. She introduced herself as a CNA, offering to help. She seemed so nice, so concerned about an elderly woman she'd never met. Jada paused, taking a sip of coffee. Allison started popping by regularly, bringing food, helping with groceries. She said she was lonely, didn't have family nearby, and caring for Grandma Layla gave her purpose. And your family thought it was a godsend, I guessed. Exactly. We were so relieved someone was looking out for her. I was in college, my parents were working double shifts. Allison seemed like a blessing. When did things start to unravel? Jada sighed heavily. About 2 months in, Allison started mentioning these little things, like she'd found Grandma confused, that she'd left the stove on, or told the same story over and over. Small things but unsettling. My stomach dropped, recognizing the pattern. And you all bought it? At first, we didn't want to believe it, but Allison was so convincing. She brought us articles about dementia, talked about the warning signs, and slowly we started noticing things about Grandma that we hadn't seen before, like she seemed more tired. Sometimes she seemed lost when we talked on the phone. Some days she couldn't recall conversations we'd had. Allison had us convinced that Grandma was declining. Jada's voice cracked, fighting back tears. The worst part was Grandma herself started doubting her own mind. She'd say to me, "Jada, I think something's wrong with me. Allison keeps telling me I forget things. Maybe she's right." "Oh my God," I whispered. "That's exactly what happened to me." Yes, and then Allison started suggesting it might be time to consider a specialized care facility. She said she knew of this wonderful, albeit expensive, place called Serenity Pines Assisted Living, where Grandma would receive the care she needed. And the family agreed? Not right away, but Allison was relentless. She accused us of being selfish, keeping Grandma at home when she needed professional care, putting our own feelings before her well-being. I recognized that tactic for what it was, guilt disguised as concern. "How long was your grandmother at that facility?" Jada's voice broke. 6 months. 6 months before she died, supposedly of heart failure. But something felt off. Grandma whispered to me that Allison visited often, always bringing her special vitamins the doctor prescribed. "Did you ever investigate those vitamins?" I tried, but it was too late. Grandma had passed, and they told me all her medical information was confidential. Jada dabbed her eyes with a napkin. But I knew something wasn't right. My grandmother had a perfectly healthy heart her whole life. No history of heart issues. What did you do? I started digging on my own. I found out Allison had actually worked at that facility before getting the CNA job. And I discovered other similar cases. Elderly folks who were admitted with sudden confusion and died of heart problems in a short time. Did you tell anyone? I tried, but I didn't have any real proof, just suspicions. The police said old folks with dementia die from complications all the time. The facility administrators claimed they did everything they could for their patients. No one wanted to listen to a grieving college kid. But you wouldn't let it go. I couldn't. Then I saw Allison at that restaurant and it was like seeing a ghost. I'd been discreetly following her for weeks, trying to piece things together. When I saw her with you and the way she looked at your wine, I knew she was about to repeat her pattern. How did you know it was the wine? I saw her slip something into your glass when you and your son were talking. It was subtle, but I was watching her closely. I had to decide. Stay silent and risk another person dying, or act without proof. Thank God you acted. Jada nodded. But what haunts me is how many other people like my grandmother, like you, Allison, has hurt. How many families have suffered because of one woman's greed and manipulation? That afternoon, Marcus met me after my talk with Jada. On the drive home, I shared everything I'd learned about Allison's methods. Marcus, I began, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest. Of course, Mom. Ask me anything. Did Allison ever mention my will or finances? Marcus visibly stiffened. After a beat he confessed. Yes. About 3 months back she started bringing it up a lot, saying it was important to get your affairs in order, especially with your mental decline. What kind of suggestions did she make? She wanted me to convince you to give me power of attorney, saying it would make things easier if something happened to you. She also suggested putting the house in my name to avoid legal hassles later. My blood ran cold. And what did you think of that? First I was hesitant. Felt premature. But Allison was persuasive. She said it was the responsible thing to do, that waiting would be a mistake. Marcus, please tell me, did I sign anything in the past few weeks that I don't clearly recall? His silence was deafening. Marcus, I need the truth. 2 weeks ago, he finally whispered. Allison said you were having a bad day, very confused and worried about your finances. She said you'd asked us over to help organize some papers. You seemed disoriented when we got there. And Allison had some documents ready, saying your lawyer recommended them. You signed them wanting to get everything settled. What documents were they? A limited power of attorney and an addition to your will. I felt the air leave my lungs. An addition? Allison said you wanted to add a clause giving me immediate control of your assets if you were declared incompetent. My voice trembling, I managed to say, Marcus, I never asked for those documents. I never spoke to my lawyer about any of this. Allison drugged me that day to make me look confused, then tricked me into signing things I never would have otherwise. Marcus steered the car into a nearby mall parking lot and buried his face in his hands. My God, Mom. I was such an idiot. I should have questioned everything, insisted on talking to your lawyer. Don't blame yourself. She'd been planning this for months, conditioning you to believe I was sick, that my judgment was off. When the time came, you were primed to believe her. What are we going to do about those papers? We're going to my lawyer first thing tomorrow and void everything. I'll explain how they were signed, and I'll make sure Allison never gets a dime of my money. That night, as Marcus phoned his lawyer to set up an emergency meeting, I reviewed my finances in my study. The scope of Allison's plot was terrifying. Those documents, signed under the influence of her drugs, would have given her complete control over my entire estate. Once she had me committed to a facility as a dementia patient, she could have manipulated my assets while keeping me drugged and isolated. And when I was no longer useful, she would have engineered my death, just like she did with Jada's grandmother. It was a flawless plan by a woman who'd perfected murder. But she made one fatal error. She underestimated the resolve of a young woman who refused to let her grandmother be forgotten. And that would be her undoing. For days after drinking the poison meant for me, Allison awoke from her coma. When Detective Lee called with the news, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Part of me was relieved she hadn't died. As evil as she was, I didn't want her death on my conscience. But I knew her waking up meant facing her. How is she? I asked into the phone. Physically, she's doing well, Detective Lee said. But mentally, she's agitated. She keeps asking for her husband, and when we told her you were okay, she had a very strong reaction. What kind of reaction? Total denial. She claims it's all a mistake, that she would never hurt anyone. What's more concerning is she keeps asking for you, Mrs. Montgomery. She wants to see you. My stomach lurched. Do I have to see her? You're not obligated, but it might help the case. Sometimes, suspects reveal things when confronted by their victims. But I understand if you're not comfortable. I considered it. Part of me wanted to hide, to pretend Allison didn't exist and let the law take its course without me. But a stronger part, a determined part, wanted to look her in the eye and show her she failed to destroy me. I'll do it, I finally said. But I want Marcus there. Of course. How about tomorrow afternoon? That evening, Marcus and I sat in my kitchen, mentally bracing ourselves. He had been fiercely protective since uncovering the truth, as if Allison could still reach me from her hospital bed. "Mom," he said, "you don't have to do this. We can let the police handle it." With more conviction than I felt, I replied, "Yes, I do. I need to see her. I need to understand how I could have been so blind." "You weren't blind, Mom. She's a master manipulator." Maybe, but part of me didn't want to see the signs. I wanted to believe I finally had a daughter-in-law who cared. Marcus took my hand. "Mom, you've always had people who care about you. You have me." "I know, honey, but it's different. You're my son. You're supposed to love me." Allison chose to be in my life, or so I thought. The idea that someone would choose me, that they considered me worthy of affection, meant a lot. And she exploited that. She exploited my loneliness, my desire for love, my fear of aging. She knew my vulnerabilities and used them against me. The next day, as we entered the hospital, it felt like walking to my execution. Detective Lee led us through corridors reeking of disinfectant and pain to the room where Allison was being guarded. A police officer stood by the door, which offered some comfort. But when the detective opened the door, and I saw Allison since that horrible night, all my preparation vanished. She was pale and gaunt, with 4 tubes connected to her arm. But her eyes held the same calculating intensity. She recognized me and immediately shifted to a feigned vulnerability. Reaching out a weak hand, she said, "Celeste, thank God you're okay." I was so worried. I remained near the door, refusing to approach. Marcus stepped protectively between us. "Allison," I said firmly, "we know what you did." Her confusion seemed genuine, but I knew better. "What are you talking about?" "I'm the one who got sick. Someone tried to poison us both." I countered, "No, someone tried to poison me, and that person was you." A flicker of darkness crossed her eyes, quickly masked by tears. "Celeste, I don't understand. I love you like a mother. I would never hurt you. How did you love Jada Reynolds' grandmother, Ella Laner Washington?" I asked. Her expression transformed. The tears vanished, the vulnerability disappeared, revealing the cold, calculating Allison. Her voice devoid of warmth, she said, "I don't know who you're talking about." Marcus stepped forward. "Allison, we found the medications at our house, your correspondence. We know about the money, the documents you tricked Mom into signing. We know everything." Allison sat up straighter, the innocent victim act crumbling. "Marcus, you have to understand. Everything I did was for us, for our future." "Our future?" he repeated incredulously. "Your mother is getting older, Marcus. She doesn't have that many good years left. Wouldn't it be better if she spent her final years in a facility where she could get proper care? So we can build a life together, free from the burden of constantly worrying." Every corner of the old house held memories of those terrible months, and I desperately needed a new space, a clean slate to build a new life. I eventually found a charming little house near Lake Lanier. It had a good-sized yard, which allowed me to spend hours working with my hands in the dirt. There's just something deeply healing about planting seeds and watching them grow, about literally creating life after having been so close to losing my own. Jada Reynolds has become an incredibly important part of my new beginning. We meet regularly for coffee, and we've developed a real friendship, something that goes far beyond the unfortunate circumstances that initially brought us together. She's finishing up her nursing degree, and I've been helping her financially with her studies. It's my way of honoring the memory of her grandmother, Eleanor, and also thanking Jada for saving my life. Mrs. Montgomery, she told me during one of our recent visits, "There's something I've been wanting to tell you." "Tell me, dear," I replied. "I've been thinking a lot about specializing in geriatric care. I want to work with older adults, help them maintain their dignity and independence for as long as possible." "That's absolutely wonderful, Jada," I told her. "What inspired you to make that decision?" "You," she replied simply. "Watching you fight to get your life back, seeing how you refuse to be defined or limited by what Allison did to you. It showed me that older people aren't helpless victims. They are warriors who have survived decades of life, and absolutely deserve respect and protection." Her words filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a very long time. Knowing that my horrible experience could somehow inspire something good in the world gave a new sense of purpose to all the pain I had suffered. I've even started speaking publicly about my experience, not to seek attention or sympathy, but to educate other families about the subtle, but often devastating signs of elder abuse. It's honestly astonishing how many people approach me after my talks to say they recognize some of the patterns I describe in their own families. One 70-year-old woman told me her son-in-law had been pressuring her to grant him access to her bank accounts using the exact same type of manipulation Allison had used on me. Another family realized their father's episodes of confusion always seemed to occur after visits from his new caregiver. I know I can't save everyone, but if my story can help prevent even one case of abuse, then everything I went through will have been worth it. Marcus has started dating someone new, a woman named Sarah, whom he met at a support group for family members of crime victims. At first, I worried a bit about how this would affect our reconstructed relationship, but Sarah is genuinely wonderful. She's transparent, honest, and completely respects the boundaries that Marcus and I have established. Mom, Marcus told me just last week, I want you to know that I will never allow anyone to hurt you again. I've learned to recognize the signs of manipulation, and I promise I will always believe you when you tell me something isn't right. Marcus, I replied, I don't need you to protect me from everything. I just need you to trust me and my judgment. I'm stronger than any of us thought. And it's the absolute truth. I am stronger. The whole process of surviving Allison's betrayal, of fighting for my sanity and ultimately my life, has taught me things about myself I never even knew. I'm 62 years old, but in many ways I feel like my real life is just beginning. I've resumed activities I had completely abandoned during the months Allison was poisoning me. I went back to my yoga classes, where my classmates welcomed me back with open arms. I joined a book club at the local public library. I even took painting lessons, something I had always wanted to do but never really found the time for. Every new activity, every new friendship, every single day I wake up without fear is a victory over what Allison tried to do to me. She tried to turn me into a helpless victim, a confused old woman who could be easily manipulated and eventually eliminated. But she failed miserably. One afternoon while I was working in my garden, I found a letter in my mailbox. It had no return address, but I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from Allison, writing from prison. For a moment, I seriously considered throwing it away unopened. I owed her absolutely nothing, and I had no obligation whatsoever to read her words. But curiosity ultimately overcame my caution. The letter was brief and typical of Allison, completely self-centered. She didn't apologize, not even a little bit, for what she had done. Instead, she complained bitterly about the prison conditions and insisted she had been misunderstood by everyone. It ended with a line that actually made me laugh, despite everything. I hope you appreciate the favor I tried to do you. Even now, even after confessing to multiple murders, Allison saw herself as the heroine of her own warped story. It was a perfect reminder of why she had been so dangerous and why my decision to cut off all contact with her, completely and permanently, had been absolutely the right one. I burned the letter in my fireplace that night, watching the words vanish into ashes. It was symbolic, I know, but it felt necessary. The last vestige of power Allison had over me turned into smoke and simply disappeared forever. This morning, as I drink my coffee on the porch of my new home, watching the sun rise over Lake Lanier, I reflect on everything I have lost and also everything I have gained. I lost my innocence regarding humanity's capacity for evil. I lost the somewhat naive version of myself that believed goodness would always be recognized and rewarded. But I gained something much more valuable. I gained the absolute certainty of my own inner strength. I gained the hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving the unthinkable. I gained a deeper, more honest relationship with my son. And I gained the immense satisfaction of knowing that my experience is somehow helping to protect others from similar situations. Marcus is arriving in about an hour for our weekly Sunday lunch. We're going to cook together, something we used to do when he was a kid, but had sadly stopped doing once Allison entered our lives. It's a tradition we've happily recovered, along with so many other things I thought I had lost forever. As I wait for him, I think of all the people who weren't as lucky as I was. Eleanor Washington and Allison's other victims never had the chance to rebuild their lives. But their memory lives on in the important work Jada and I are doing to prevent future abuse. At 62, I've definitely learned that life can change in an instant. It can turn into a nightmare without any warning. But it can also transform into something unexpectedly beautiful when you least expect it. The key is to never give up, to keep fighting, even when it seems like all hope is lost. I am Celeste Montgomery. I survived an attempted murder by my own family. And I am here to tell my story, not as a victim, but as a warrior who refused to be silenced. And every single day I wake up free, healthy, and completely in control of my own life is my sweetest revenge against those who thought they could destroy me. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.